I'm Eric, and I'm doing the world's first LS swap Mercedes SLK. But I've run into a couple of problems, and we're going to see if we can resolve them, but I think it's going to take more than this one video. Let me know if you're doing an LS swap or you're doing an engine swap on your car too. I'd love to hear your feedback. Hit me up in the comments down below. So as I've been doing this project, I've been doing a lot of research on figuring out how can I get this LS engine over here into the engine bay of this SLK. And there is one problem that I think might be a big showstopper, so we're going to try to resolve it. I think it's going to take a couple of episodes to do that, so let's just get right into it. I've been doing a lot of research, and there's another guy who actually did an engine swap on the SLK as well. His name is Aaron, and I found him on SLK World. Shout out to SLK World online. So he did an engine swap, and he took a 4.2 liter V8 Mercedes engine and put it into the SLK, and he ran into some pretty big problems that I was considering that, and I think they might be kind of a showstopper, and I want to avoid the problem that he ran into. So the biggest problem is this steering column, and I'll show you that in a second. And what he did is he actually replaced the steering rack from the SLK with something from a Mercedes 430, I think, or rather a Mercedes W211, and he had to do a lot of fabrication work on it to make it fit. In fact, I think that was his biggest issue, was this whole steering system. So here's this super interesting steering box. I haven't seen anything like this before. You can see the steering column coming out of the firewall, and then it goes right into this box over here by the inner fender. It's a little bit hidden by the power steering hose. But this is where my headers would go normally, and they'd normally go in a V8 configuration. So this is sort of the main issue. In a normal steering system, you're going to see the steering rack connected to the cross member. This one is quite strange. So now we're getting over into Aaron's swap. So this is the donor card that he used for the steering rack. This is a Mercedes 430. I think it's a W211. I'm not quite sure of the year, but I think it's around the same vintage as the SLK. So here's the actual steering rack itself. You can see he pulled it out of the car. Looks like a pretty typical steering rack. Does not look like the one currently in the SLK by any means at all. What he did was, here's the cross member, and you can see his car is yellow. He's kind of mounting it up here. He's basically fabricating it. You can see these cardboard pieces. These are going to be the mounts that he's attaching to the cross member, which he's going to fabricate, which are going to hold the steering rack in place. So here's a close-up of the mounts that he's going to make. He's welded them onto the cross member, and it's looking pretty good. And he's got this steering rack in place now. You can see on the left side there's a bit of an issue with the body there going out to the wheel. That's where the tie rod end is. It's touching the body. On the right hand side, he's done some cutting. All right, so here's actually the cutting that he did. He basically cut into the side of the body there near where the wheel well is, or perhaps into the wheel well. The steering rack is actually touching the lower control arm. That's the black thing here. And so that's kind of a bit of an issue. So there's a little bit of a better view of what he actually did. So we cut out quite a bit by the cross member there, and you can also see where it's touching the lower control arm over there in the top left of this photo. So here's the steering column that he created. So the problem was that he had is because the steering column originally goes way over to the left hand side and is extremely short and goes to that funky steering box that I showed you, he needed to create a new steering column that is much longer and also has additional U-joints in it. So here's another view of it. I think he fabricated this from scratch, or perhaps he used something else. I don't quite remember, but he did make some custom U-joints on it. So props to Aaron for really doing a lot of fabrication work on this thing. Pretty crazy in my mind. All right, here's one of these custom U-joints that he made. And the reason that he did it, I'm going to show you this in the next picture, is that because the angle of the steering column coming into the engine bay and going to where the steering rack, or rather the steering box used to be, looks like this. So previously, if you remember, the steering box is way over to the right-hand side of the picture up against the inner fender. And here, with this new steering rack, it is offset and it's more to the middle. So he had to make this crazy U-joint system. And what he said in the forum post, if I remember correctly, is that it didn't work that well and that it was sort of binding up a little bit. So that was not so good. So now we get over to the lower control arms here, and you can see he's got all these nice dots on them. And that's where the tie rod ends. The ends of the steering rack are contacting these lower control arms. So he's gonna have to cut into them, and that really concerns me. It's something that I actually don't want to do in my car. So you can see where he's cut the lower control arm here, and he's cut into it quite a bit. So there's a lot of cutting now. He's cut into the body, and he's cut the lower control arm, and that's something that personally I don't really want to do, because we're getting into a lot of fabrication work, and that if I do this, it's going to slow down my engine swap tremendously. And also, when you're cutting into the lower control arms, obviously there's a potential for breakage. So he did weld up some reinforcements across the bottom of these control arms to make them stronger. But for my money, it's not something that I'm personally comfortable with doing, because I plan to take this thing out in the canyons. What he did here, now we're looking at the revised steering column. And so this is the one I just showed you a couple of minutes ago. Now it's going into the steering box, and it's a lot more direct. He got rid of all those crazy U-joints, and he did this over a couple of months, so this is sort of the process that he took. He also obviously needed to move the steering column over to the right-hand side to be more in the center of the engine bay as opposed to over on the driver's side. So he had to offset it. He had to cut into the firewall, and this is the new steering column, and you can see his U-joint that he did at the top coming from the steering wheel as well. And here's actually what his car looks like. Aaron took his car out for a little bit of a drive. I'm going to show you this video right here. It's actually pretty cool what he did with the car, and I mean, just huge props to Aaron for doing all this work. He's kind of paving the way for me doing this LS swap, but he has definitely informed what I'm planning to do with my car. So that is a lot of work just to make the steering rack work. That's not very funny, actually. So that kind of concerns me, because there's a lot of cutting into the metal. There is cutting into the lower control arms, and I definitely want to take this out in canyons and not just go in straight lines. So I definitely want all the strength that the suspension, the stock suspension, can give me. There's not a lot of aftermarket support for this car, so I'm very loath to be cutting into the lower control arms, and I don't like cutting into the body structure so much either. And I think that's just going to really slow down the swap. So that is the one thing that I think could have stopped my swap in its tracks. I'm just planning to keep the stock steering rack, the steering system, with everything in place, and that's going to make it really difficult to fit the headers in. So that's going to be what I'm going to be talking about in the next episode. So if you are into this LS swap, please hit subscribe. Here's all my social media, and I'll see you guys in the next video.